So today I'm going to be talking about Pokemon and what it can tell us about multiculturalism in Japan. So to start, just kind of my own philosophy of studying pop culture. Pop culture is a study of these kind of cultural products that I think can be so interesting because they tell us about a kind of material culture, because we can talk about who consumes them, and that tells us about what those people value, what attracts them. But we can also talk about producers, who's making these things, who's advertising them. And that gives us something about how those companies are imagining the public and also what kind of values are informing those companies. So I like Pokemon a lot because Pokemon, first of all, it's become this massive global thing, but it started out as very local and very Japanese. So it has these roots that are very connected to Japan, but now you can look at global consumption patterns, you can look at global advertising, and see some very interesting, very different things. Also, Pokemon is now like 20 years old. So it has this long history, and you can see how it's changed over time as it's become more and more global. So actually, if you're interested in those things, I'm not going to talk about those a whole lot today. I'm going to be in a more specific direction. But if you're interested in those ideas, I have a YouTube video that I made, just like I'm making right now, of a lecture that I gave for this class last year that's much more focused on Pokemon within globalization and what happens when Pokemon comes to America and what global popularity of Pokemon has meant for Japan. So I think Silke will send you the link if you're interested. Please feel free to check it out. The last thing I want to mention is, of course, anytime we're studying culture, we're also studying humans. And so there's this sense that we need to remember we're being respectful, that this isn't just about pointing to another culture and saying, oh, they're so weird. Sometimes it feels that way. But we need to remember to try to see things from other perspectives as well and to keep ourselves open and respectful. So today, this is a basic rundown of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to start with a little bit of history, actually, that probably won't seem very connected to Pokemon. I'm going to talk about pre-war and war-era Japan and a little bit of post-war Japan. And I'm going to talk about the ideas of multiculturalism and identity in those eras. You're welcome to take pictures, by the way, and this slide will keep popping up as we go through so you know where we are in the lecture. Also, key terms are highlighted, so if you don't know what those mean, pay attention. Then we're going to talk about what it meant for Pokemon to become a part of global pop culture, what effect that had in Japan in terms of Japan's new model for spreading its pop culture abroad. Then we'll talk a little bit about how issues of race and ethnicity appear in Pokemon and have changed over time. And then I'm going to tie all these three things together in the last part where I talk about the most recent Pokemon game, Pokemon Sun and Moon, which came out last November. Is anyone else playing Pokemon Sun and Moon? Did you choose the owl? Because if not, we are not friends. Okay. Okay, so first part. War, identity, and multiculturalism in Japan. So from 1895 to 1945, Japan was an empire. That means it wasn't just a country, it had colonies. Right? In historical perspective, Japan was, of course, not the only empire, and Japan was very late in joining the empire game. This was something that America and Europe had been doing for a very long time, and Japan had suddenly become a more modern, more westernized country and wanted to kind of join in this competition and show that it was a big global player just like the other countries. So if we look at Japan prior to war with the US, we can see it expanded quite a bit, right? First it added Taiwan. Sorry, these dates do not show at all, do they? Taiwan in 1895, Korea in 1905 and then 1910. In the 1920s, the early 1920s, at the end of World War I, Japan took over all of these little South Sea islands. Then in 1931, it expanded into northern China. So Japan had a very large network of colonies. And what this meant for Japan was that it was, by default, a multicultural society. Very often when we talk about Japan today, people imagine it as kind of this monocultural, there's Japanese people and Japanese culture, and those both mean one thing. That's a very problematic position, and that's also a very new position, it turns out. That during this period, it was very normal to acknowledge Japan as including people from Taiwan, from Korea, from even these South Sea Islands, or from Manchuria, from northern China, that they were all Japanese subjects. There was still an ethnic hierarchy, that in a lot of cases Japanese were still on top, but there was no sense of Japan is only for Japanese people, or there is only one type of Japanese people. Once Japan went to war with the United States, at the same time that it attacked Pearl Harbor, it was moving south into Southeast Asia, and it was taking over a lot of former European colonies, right? We had, first was Vietnam, and then moved into Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Burma, etc., etc. So as the Japanese empire expanded into all of these European colonies, the message that they came with was, we're here to save you from the Europeans. That Asia shouldn't be a place that white people exploit. It should be Asia for Asians. And they labeled this the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. This is the kind of propaganda they used, right? All of the peoples of Asia joined together in their struggle against colonialism and benefiting each other. So this is another kind of Japanese multicultural identity that we see. However, this one, first of all, it invariably cast Japan as the leader. It said that Japan should be in charge of this Pan-Asian cooperation. And so again, there was this kind of implied hierarchy. At the same time, in terms of actual practice, what was really going on in a lot of these former colonies was that the Japanese moved in and exploited the people and used violence against the people in the same ways, or in some cases even in worse ways than the Europeans had. Now this is a really interesting period in history, because a lot of people will say that it's largely due to this, that it was difficult for the Europeans to go back, and it led to the independence after World War II of a lot of these regions. But what I want to focus on is this idea of Japan moving into the rest of Asia under this umbrella of, we're here to liberate you, and we're going to lead you, and we're all going to work together as Asians resisting white colonialism. Of course, the end result was that Japan lost the war. And so after the war, you have things going in a very different direction. Immediately after the war, Japan lost control of all of its former colonies. Right? Taiwan reverted back to China. Korea became an independent nation. All of these places were separated from Japan. At the same time, there was this very strong public outcry against the war and against the ideology of the war. And so this led to a rejection of the war-era multiculturalism. Right? This was both acknowledging that Korean people and Taiwanese people, for example, were no longer Japanese. And it was also kind of highlighting this, oh, we're on our own now, we're not expanding, we're not taking over other people, it's just us. So you have this rejection of wartime multiculturalism. Then not long after that, Japan starts on this road of tremendous economic growth. Right? The 1960s and 70s in Japan are known as the economic miracle. Right? No other country had experienced such rapid growth and such immense growth, such a huge improvement in lifestyle, in consumption, in such a short period of time. And this led people both in Japan and outside of Japan to look at Japan and say, something here is special. Something here is different. Right? Something here is happening in Japan that has never happened anywhere else. And they started looking often for cultural or ethnic reasons for that, saying there's something about Japanese culture or Japanese people that make them so successful in this rapid economic growth. This led to a lot of theories about what is it that's different about Japanese people. And these theories fall into this category called Nihonjinron. It literally means theories on Japanese people. These became popular myths, very common in Japan, but also you can find them in America. Ideas about Japanese people being very unique, even in fact, more unique, perhaps, than people from other countries or other cultures. And that part of that uniqueness coming from a very homogeneous idea of Japanese people, that there's one Japanese people, there's one Japanese culture. that it's unchanging, that it's unified, and that it's special and different from everything and everyone else. This is kind of the thinking informing these theories. So, some examples of how this thinking works. One way is it comes out in this very strong binary that you have Japanese people and you have non-Japanese people. And these two things are opposites, right? That there's nothing in between and that all people fall into these two categories. Right? This is problematic because on the one hand, that means non-Japanese people, right? It equates French people with people from South Africa, with people from New Zealand, with people from Indonesia, right? Because they all fall under this category of non-Japanese. It has the same effect within Japan. It erases differences within Japan. It says Japanese people are one group, one community, one culture. So it's a very problematic way of thinking, but it's still fairly common even in Japanese media and popular culture today. And so as you go through this class, you may find examples of it. And one other problem with this is it creates this idea that if you're not Japanese, if you weren't born in Japan and raised in Japan and you're not ethnically Japanese, then you'll never really get Japan because it's too unique, it's too different. Of course, we can always say that's a little bit true, right? You can kind of resonate with that. If you didn't grow up speaking Japanese and you're learning it now, you can think, well, I will never be as good as a native speaker. And that's true. But this thinking is more along the lines of no one will ever really get it, right? That it's impossible for anyone outside of Japan to ever really comprehend Japan. So this way of thinking, on the one hand, it's a kind of source of pride, but on the other hand, it's a source of isolation. So this thinking leads to three things. It leads to patriotic feelings, right? Oh, Japan is so special, is so different, is so great. But it also leads to a sense of protectionism, right? Of, oh, what is Japanese must be preserved, must be protected from globalization. And that can be good and bad, right? We can see that as something it keeps foreign influence out and preserves what's special. But we can also see it as kind of locking in what's special and not allowing for the culture to change and develop. And then the last is that it can lead to this kind of paranoia, right? Oh, globalization is coming in to change us. We are vulnerable. We need to protect what we have, right? We're different and no one understands us. So how can we communicate with others? If I think of a couple of examples, some of the classic examples of Nihon Jinron are, for example, that Japanese society is always organized as a hierarchy, whereas other societies are organized on equal levels. Or that Japanese have a special emotion relating to how they feel about their mothers that other people don't have. These are some examples of this kind of theorization of what's unique or special or different about Japanese. Okay, so I'm going to jump to the next topic. And I promise I'll bring all these together again in the end. So let's talk now finally about Pokémon, right? First, probably everyone is familiar with Pokémon, I hope, but very quickly, means pocket monsters, right? It is the number 2 video game franchise in the world. What's number 1? Mario, yes. As of today, there have been 950 episodes of the Pokémon anime aired in Japan, less than America, because it takes a little time for them to get here. And as of last year, there have been 19 movies. There will be another movie this year. So this is actually one way of measuring the age of Pokémon, right? They put out one movie every year, so we can tell this is it's actually the 21st year, because the first movie came out in the second year of Pokémon's existence. It's also a collectible card game, as Silke knows, because one of her sons is a big fan. And there's a huge amount of merchandise. I'm personally wearing Pikachu socks right now, but I'm not going to show you, just trust me. And then, of course, hopefully everybody knows Pikachu, right? Pikachu can come in all kinds of forms now. He's become a very iconic figure, so it's really easy to spot and recognize him, even when he's a hamburger. So, okay, those are kind of the basics. What's interesting for me about Pokémon is how quickly and how thoroughly it became a global phenomenon, right? Pokémon hit US TV around 1998, 1999, and instantly took off. I remember in 1999 that Pokémon was on TV every morning before school and every afternoon after school. And I remember that because I worked in a daycare center, and those kids had to watch it every morning and every afternoon. And I got really tired of it really quickly. But so it became kind of saturating kids' media. It was everywhere. It was influencing kids' buying habits. It was even influencing the kind of anime that was being produced in America, right? We started making more Japanese-style cartoons. Other cartoons from Japan started coming to America. And this really opened the door for a huge trend of Japanese pop culture coming to America. Before this, we had little things. We had some Dragon Ball, we had some Sailor Moon, but it was a very select group of people who were watching these cartoons. Pokémon was watched by everyone, and that was this big change, so that even Time magazine was putting Pokémon on their cover. After hitting America, Pokémon went global. And so now we can watch the anime in over 40 countries and over 70 languages. Right? This is Pokémon in Arabic. So this is interesting, I think, because it shows how Pokémon really opened the door for other Japanese cultural products to go abroad. This process also had its own issues. Very recently, there was a lot of debate among different Chinese-speaking regions about how to write Pikachu and how to write Pokémon. Right? Taiwan, China, and Hong Kong all had different styles for how to write Pokémon, how to write the names of each Pokémon, such as Pikachu. So when they made a video game in Chinese and said, this is the official version, there were people who actually got upset, who said, no, that's not the way we've been writing Pikachu all this time. So with this global expansion of Pokémon, suddenly Japanese culture becomes cool across the world. And people notice. One of the first to notice was a journalist named Douglas McGray. And in 2002, he coined the phrase cool Japan. He also talked about gross national cool. He said that it is now possible to become a powerful, influential country through popular, fun, exciting products. That it was no longer necessary to just have economic power or to just have military power. He said, cool Japan is a sign of Japan's soft power. So soft meaning that it's not power to force people, it's power to make people like you. And that if they like you, they'll probably do what you want. The Japanese government loved this idea. They said, oh, if everyone loves Japanese products, everyone will have a positive image of Japan. And so they started to promote this actively, and it became a central government strategy, this idea of cool Japan. It became Japanese government policy to make Japan look cool in foreign countries and to promote industries and products abroad that would make people think Japan was cool. So, for example, this is from actually this month. This month, the Japanese government put out a special guidebook on their Cool Japan strategy. This is page 2, and the first picture in the whole thing is Pikachu. So Pikachu, even now, is still seen as this central figure in the government's vision of what cool Japan means. This, by the way, is Tsuruho Yosuke. He is the Minister of Cool Japan. That's a position that's existed since, I believe, 2010. So the government is even assigning politicians the job of managing these strategies and promoting these products at top levels of government. The current strategy is based on these 3 parts. The first part is showing people abroad how cool Japan and Japanese culture are. The second part is about making sure that the Japanese products can reach foreign countries by increasing distribution networks. And then the third part is about encouraging people to come to Japan and consume. So that's kind of the directions they're going in with all of these different strategies for cool Japan. So what's interesting about this is that they are taking their culture and saying our culture is an exportable good. And of course, the idea behind this, as I said, is that it's getting other people to like Japanese culture. So as you hopefully picked up from the Iwabuchi article that you read for today, everyone read it, right? You had a test. I trust you. A big part of this strategy is relying on other countries to have respect for other cultures, right? In order to believe that Pikachu and other Japanese products will make people respect Japan, you have to accept that multiculturalism is a thing in those countries, that people in those countries are interested in liking and respecting other cultures. So built into Cool Japan, you have this rhetoric of multiculturalism, right? Spreading respect for other cultures, spreading tolerance internationally. This becomes a key aspect of the strategy in terms of what the Japanese government wants from other countries. At the same time, there's this huge national pride that comes from Cool Japan, right? If Japan becomes a world leader of cool, that's great, right? Japanese people can look at that and say, yes, everyone in the world knows that we make the best video games, that we make the best anime, that our pocket monsters are better than other countries' pocket monsters. Okay? But when you combine this kind of pride with putting very strict limits on which culture is exportable and which culture is not, it can create problems. And when I say this defining exportable culture, if you look at what the Japanese government is usually trying to send abroad, it's things that they can trust people in other countries to appreciate, right? So what I mean by this is it links back to this Nihon Jinron thinking that people outside of Japan don't really get Japanese culture, right? That we can understand Pikachu, but they may not necessarily trust us to make good soba in California, right? Because that's too close to traditional Japanese culture, and non-Japanese people are not supposed to understand that. So when you combine these two things, this pride, but also this sense of which culture can go abroad and which culture is truly and only ours, then it builds this, or it strengthens this sense of the monoculturalism, that Japan has this one unique culture that, sure, the cute, fun parts of it can go abroad, but there's still this core that remains, that is amazing, that is cool, but that is not for sharing. Okay, I'm going to jump to part 3, and then we'll get into tying all this together. This is going faster than I thought it would. I think we'll be okay. Okay, so let's talk a bit about how race and ethnicity appear in Pokémon, which may sound strange, especially if you played the early games. Like, what does that even mean? But where did my word go? That's weird. Okay, so all the words have disappeared from this slide, which is strange. But basically, so this says mukokuseki, which is your key word. So write that down. Mukokuseki is the idea that a product, so literally it means without a nationality, right? But when used to talk about products, it means that that product doesn't have a cultural odor, right? That product doesn't specifically associate with a given country or a given ethnic group. This has been used to describe how Cool Japan has been so successful, right? How products like Pokémon have been able to go abroad and be such a big hit is because it's easy for people in other countries to relate and connect to them because there's nothing about them that feels foreign. Does that make sense? So if we look at Ash, or Satoshi, right, in Japanese, you can ask this question, what ethnicity is he? Right? I've had students from Japan say, oh, well, he's obviously Japanese. He lives in Japan. His name is Satoshi. I've had people from Mexico saying, oh, I always assumed he was Mexican. Right? Because he doesn't necessarily look like a given race. We can point to races he does not look like. But if we said, oh, he's a light-skinned Arab, okay. He's Mediterranean, possible. He's Mongolian, okay, right? He comes from the anime mukokuseki aesthetic, right? This idea that looking at someone, you don't instantly label them with a specific culture or ethnicity. So that, again, they don't feel foreign. Now, an even more extreme example of this is Pikachu, right? What about Pikachu is Japanese, right? If you encountered an adorable electric mouse, would you think, oh, clearly you're from Japan, right? Nothing about this is Japanese. We can talk about, oh, there's the anime style, which is kind of a Japanese style that maybe we connect to Japan. But that within that style itself, looking at this character, there's nothing very Japanese about this character. So again, this connects to this idea of how was it so popular? Because people in Israel and people in Australia could look at the same character and say, oh yeah, I get that. That doesn't feel strange to me. That doesn't feel like it's foreign. It doesn't feel like it's from somewhere else. So Mukokuseki is interesting because it creates a blank slate, right? If an object has no ethnic link, if it has no historical or cultural identity, you can project those things onto it. So a couple of recent examples I've found. There's actually a million ways you can look at this, but some recent favorites of mine. First, a couple of Facebook groups. This is Pokémon, so it's the extreme left political Pokemon page. This is genderqueer Gengar, so it's a trans positive and genderqueer positive Pokemon page. And I don't know if anyone still plays Pokemon Go. I still do, but I'm kind of burning out. But when it first started, the Westboro Baptist Church, if you don't know the Westboro Baptist Church, this is the center of some of the worst homophobic activity in America. But churches are all Pokemon gyms or Pokestops, right? So when the Westboro Baptist Church became a Pokemon gym, it was immediately taken over by a pink fairy named Love is Love, right? So this is a kind of political statement here too, right? And so these are all ways that we can take something that doesn't have a political or ethnic or cultural value attached to it, and we can kind of push one onto it. Yes? Yeah, oh no, you're absolutely right. We can't really point to it and say this is a Japanese game. It launched in America long before it launched in Japan. And you're right, because Niantic is American, Google is American, but the characters come from the original Pokemon series from Japan. They're obviously licensed from Game Freak, from Nintendo. So it's very difficult to say, right? But we can still look at this and say it's still the original Mukokuseki character design. And it's still this game that's designed not for one country, but for a global appeal. And so it's designed to work anywhere and for people anywhere to play this game and instantly not feel that it's foreign or alien to them. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. So over time, this idea of Mukokuseki has led to even the creators of Pokemon being aware that issues of ethnicity, of race, of culture, of history can be projected onto Pokemon. And the very, very famous example of this, which you read about, is Jinx, aka Rujira, right? Jinx originally, well, in the original video game, everything was black and white. Nobody had any color. But when Jinx first premiered in the anime, she looked like this. This was shown in America, and American viewers reacted with, oh, that's blackface. That's a racist depiction of African Americans. That's unacceptable. And so, starting with American releases, they made her purple. But by 2002, she was purple worldwide. So this shows at least a little bit of consciousness within the Pokemon company that, oh, we can't have a character that looks like this because we are alienating customers who are sensitive to this kind of issue. So you see this slow buildup of consciousness about race, even within this Mukokuseki world of Pokemon. I want to look very closely at the Pokemon games now, and about how concepts of race emerged within those games. So the first 4 games of Pokemon all took place within Japan, right? The first one was, I wonder if I can't mouse it. Oh, there we go. The first one was here in Kanto, which is a Tokyo area. The next one is in this area called Johto, Generation 2. The third one is in Hoenn, which is Kyushu. And the last one is here in Sinnoh, which is Hokkaido. So these all very, very clearly, obviously map onto the map of Japan, right? These are the actual maps from the games, and you can see how they basically map up exactly with the geography of Japan. So this is a pretty clear image. You're playing inside Japan. Of course, it's all, fictional versions of Japan with different names. But while the game's taking place within Japan, everybody follows this Mukokuseki aesthetic, right? They all have crazy hair. They all have pretty white skin. So these are all from Sinnoh, from the 4th generation in Hokkaido. These are the leaders of the Pokemon gyms. All of the characters look like this. So they're following this Mukokuseki aesthetic, right? Even though it's in Japan, they're not making them look Japanese. They're just making them look Mukokuseki. The only counterexample of this comes from Generation 2. In Generation 2, there were some kimono girls who look more obviously Japanese. Although, what does that mean by more obviously Japanese? It's really more hairstyle and dress, right? But they're linked to specifically Japanese cultural locations. They dance in shrines, right? So this, I think, is kind of a way of looking at these games and saying, well, it's very clearly located in Japan, because when you go into a shrine, you have girls dancing in kimono. In Generation 5, suddenly we go to New York, to Unova, right, which is very clearly based on New York. What's interesting in Unova is, like the real New York, there's a little bit of ethnic and racial diversity. For the first time, you start to see characters emerging who are not Mukokuseki and are not clearly white. However, these aren't necessarily great representations. The first kind of, I guess you would read them as African-American characters to appear, are all breakdancers and basketball players, right? So could be worse, but these are still they're still pigeonholing these characters into very specific roles. And as I said, could be worse. You also have this fairly problematic gym leader named Lenora, she's the first person of color to be a gym leader. So in that sense, it's kind of progressive. Okay, we have a gym leader who is clearly not Mukokuseki and also not white. But at the same time, her dress and her way of speaking are very reminiscent of the mammy stereotype, right? Like the kind of black nanny, maid, cook character that's seen as a very overused stereotype in older American media. But you also had Marshall and Iris. So you have a little bit more inclusion. As I said, part of what's interesting for me about this is that this is happening in New York, right? For 4 generations in Japan, which went all the way through 2010. So that means well after the idea of Jinx as having a race and not needing a race, and this idea of race consciousness came in. When the games are still in Japan, everyone was Mukokuseki. But once they go to New York, we start having ethnic diversity. This was also true in Generation 6 when we go to France. And France was much less problematic. We had 2 gym leaders of color. You have Grant and you have Valerie. But what's interesting about Generation 6 in France, it's called Kalos, by the way, in France. What's interesting here is that you also have characters who are explicitly labeled as Japanese, but they're also explicitly labeled as tourists. So they're all like Tourist Takashi or Tourist Minako, right? They all have clear Japanese names, but they're all tourists. So this is interesting to me because Japanese people are included in this world, but they're not included in this country, right? They're still seen as separate from this foreign world of France. So it's still kind of suggesting this division between Japanese and non-Japanese, between Japanese and foreign. This insider-outsider dynamic. Okay, so having built up through all of the generations of Pokemon, I want to talk now about the most recent generation. Pokemon Sun and Moon, Generation 7, which came out back in November. Pokemon Sun and Moon takes place in Alola, which is Hawaii. This is interesting because Hawaii is one of the most multicultural places in the United States, right? Because many Japanese people have visited Hawaii, and there's a strong awareness in Japan that Hawaii is this multicultural, multiracial place. So Hawaii was a great platform to show some very big changes in the Pokemon universe. We see here suddenly a very big shift away from 99% Mukokiseki and then a couple of characters that represent people of color to people like this, right? These are just veteran trainers. These are just rising stars. She's just an athletic girl. These characters are no longer being pigeonholed into specific categories based on what race they are, right? That they're suggesting that children of any race can be a rising star Pokemon trainer or can be a veteran Pokemon trainer. So you have this getting away from the stereotyping or from the pigeonholing into a more inclusive vision of multiculturalism. And this is also reflected in the gym leaders, right? They're not called gym leaders in Pokemon 7. It gets very complicated. But these kind of main characters, you have many more important characters who are people of color, right? And they're not necessarily as problematic in their representations. But the biggest change, and this goes back to my title slide, right? The one that a lot of people have been really excited about is that for the first time, you can now choose your own skin color when you play Pokemon. And you can choose to be a player who is, any of these 4 shades. So still, it doesn't represent the full spectrum, but it gives people an opportunity, particularly it gives children an opportunity to not just identify with other characters, but to also put themselves in a way that perhaps makes it easier for them to connect with the character. So this has received a lot of praise. And in fact, if you look at the advertisements, even the advertisements produced within Japan, there was a lot of highlighting this new dynamic, which suggests that this is something that fans have really been asking for, or it's something that Pokemon is really proud of doing, that, okay, we're finally being inclusive. We want the main character to represent as many people as it can so that everyone can feel connected to who they're playing in the game. I think this is really interesting because by assigning race to so many characters, you're really destabilizing this idea of Mukokiseki. It really doesn't work anymore because you can't look at some of these characters and say, oh, he's from anywhere, she's from anywhere, because they're getting these ethnic or racial or cultural images now more clearly attached to them. They're moving away from the Mukokiseki aesthetic into a more multicultural, diverse aesthetic. Another interesting direction that this is going in is with the professors. Every Pokemon game has the professor who gives you your first Pokemon, who researches Pokemon. They're all named after trees. The Hawaiian professor is Professor Kukui. And on the one hand, we have a professor who's a person of color, and this is new. This hasn't happened before. So this is seen as a good thing, right? It's showing that, intellectual achievements aren't limited only to white-looking people. But on the other hand, there's some problems with him, right? He looks very casual, right? He looks like he's not really serious. He talks to the character always saying, cousin. He has an alter ego as a professional wrestler. And he's the only Pokemon professor that ever fights you. Sorry if that was a spoiler alert. I'm sorry. So there's some talk of, is this a good representation or a bad representation? On the one hand, there are things here where you can say, oh yeah, I know people in Hawaii who are kind of like that. But then there's also the sense of, but should this be representing the professor from Hawaii? Is this the best way to show that? And I'm not going to give you an answer for that, because I think it's kind of okay to feel either way. But the one last thing I will mention about him is, compared to all the other professors, he's kind of half naked. And this is interesting because there was this whole trend in the 1990s of Japanese women going to Hawaii for liaisons with Hawaiian men. So there's this kind of older trend of sexualization of Hawaiian men in Japan. And so it's also interesting to me that they chose to make him half naked. When I tried to find this picture, there was a lot of really interesting fan art that I do not recommend. But I thought it was really interesting that he is, I mean, we can talk about how the women, like she's pretty sexualized too. I wouldn't expect my professor to wear a tube top to class, for example. But still, it's interesting that the Hawaiian character is also the half-naked character. And then another thing to point out in these is that all of the characters that move the plot forward, all of the characters that are really central to the plot of this game, are like the whitest characters in the game. Now, in the past, characters like this would just have been Mukokuseki, right? If you think about Sailor Moon has blonde hair and blue eyes, but she's a Japanese schoolgirl because she's Mukokuseki, and it's fine. Somehow that just works. I mean, you don't have to agree with that, but that's the thinking behind it, is that Sailor Moon is just a Japanese schoolgirl. And so in the past, these guys would have just been characters in the Pokemon world. But now when we get to Hawaii, everyone has a very clear ethnicity, which means these people have a very clear white ethnicity. And they are all extremely central to the moving of the plot, right? Everything that happens is because of these three characters. So you spend a lot of time rescuing them or fighting them or talking with them or going on adventures with them. And they're still the ones that move things forward. Okay, I want to show you a couple of videos. And then I want to take a minute to kind of discuss those videos with you. But the last thing that I think is really interesting to look at with this new version of Pokemon is one particular advertisement. Or it's actually a series of 3 YouTube videos. We're going to watch number 1 and number 3. I'll tell you what happens in number 2. It's not that interesting. But we'll watch number 1 so you get the context, number 3 so you can see the meat, the really interesting things that are happening. And then we'll talk about how Hawaii, how Japanese people and Pokemon are being portrayed in this new, more multicultural vision. Okay, so that's part 1. Part 2, he kind of has a fight with them, and then they become friends again, and then they all discover this amazing secret base in the jungle. Obviously. But, oh, what did I just do? I just clicked something weird. Okay, so let's watch part 3. Okay, as I said, this was a series of YouTube videos that was made primarily, or at least originally, for advertising in Japan. You can tell the main character is Japanese, right? A lot of the language happenings in Japanese, but then it's brought to, or it was brought over to America and on YouTube for anyone to consume as well. So how does this depict the place of Japanese children in a multicultural world? What visions or images of multiculturalism can we pull out of this advertisement? Any thoughts? Yeah. Okay, so they're shy, that they're not good at making friends. Pretty common stereotype of Japanese people. Yes. Okay, he's afraid of being an outsider. He wants to be included. He wants to make friends. Anything else stand out for you? Yeah. He's temporary. Yeah, he goes back to Japan. He's a visitor. He's just like the tourists in France, right? He goes and he has his experience and then he leaves because he's still a Japanese insider and they're still foreign outsiders, right? So that barrier still exists. Anything else? Yeah. He has to be recognized by the white guy. This point, I think, is really interesting. The first time I watched this, let me show you what I saw. I looked at this, and I thought of this. This is a Japanese boy taking these locals from this island whose land has been taken from them by big, mean white dudes and saying, I will lead you to take your land back, and together we will resist them. Right? This is so interesting to me because this is, of course, the classic model of Japanese multiculturalism. Now, I don't think that the creators were necessarily trying to include this, but I think it shows that this was still kind of lurking in the back of their minds, that what's the model for multiculturalism? Oh, well, obviously, the Japanese kid is the leader, even though he's in Hawaii and there's a Hawaiian kid there too, right? Of course, this isn't something we can accuse only Japan of doing. If you've seen the movie Avatar, you know that there's a long history of American media about white people saving native people, right? So we have this problematic aspect, right, that you have this very similar kind of struggle over, getting the white people out of the colony with the help of the Japanese leader and pulling everyone together in this Japanese-led model of multiculturalism. The other thing that stood out for me from this was, and it relates to, I think you're right that the idea of him going back really highlights this separation, right? That he's temporary, that he's not a part of that world, he's a part of Japan. Yeah. Right. So it's still creating that connection, building that bridge, and celebrating the friendship too. And that's a real thing. I think that's cool. But here's the other thing that I saw from that part. Here we have them all in Hawaii, and here's Tokyo. And again, we have this really stark contrast, right? We have Hawaii as this beautiful, natural, but lush, undeveloped, untouched jungle, right? Whereas Tokyo is this futuristic urban environment, right? In a way, I think this kind of highlights a certain hierarchy too, right? It creates this kind of exotic native element to Hawaii versus the more ultra-modern version of Tokyo. And this is something that you can find in any kind of colonial discourse throughout history, right? That you always have the main country, which is so civilized, so sophisticated, and then the colony, which is so, beautiful and exotic, but kind of backwards and underdeveloped. So the kind of images that are highlighted, I think, tell us something too. And of course, this isn't the only image they show. They show him in the classroom and things, but a lot of what he's doing is outside. And if you watch the second video, which we didn't do, it's mostly them climbing trees and grabbing bugs and doing things out in the jungle. So it's very, very different from what you would expect of a Tokyo lifestyle. Now, there's a lot of other interesting things that we can pull out of this particular video. We could talk about why did only mom go with him to Hawaii, or why did mom go to Hawaii to begin with versus dad staying home, which I think Silke might have some interesting things to say about from her research. But I want to kind of stop there and wrap up my points, and then we'll have some time for your thoughts and opinions and discussion. So my 3 points that I want to end with. Number 1, changes in Pokemon illustrate a shift from creating the universal Mukokuseki products that sparked cool Japan to products that reflect the ethnic diversity of their global consumers, right? I think this is a good thing. I think it's good for children around the world to be able to relate to the characters in their media, to not feel like only white kids can be heroes, right? Or to feel like black characters always have to play basketball. So I think that this is a good change. I think this is a positive sign, and it's something that comes out very clearly in the new game that we didn't have in previous generations. We also don't have it in Pokemon Go, right? All the avatars in Pokemon Go are white. The professor is white. The kind of Mukokuseki white, right? All of the team leaders. Second, at the same time, this highlights the differential treatment of races within Pokemon and can suggest that multiculturalism is still external to Japan, thus supporting Nihon Jinron thinking. So there's 2 parts to unpack here. First, if we acknowledge that characters in Pokemon have different races, then we acknowledge that different races are treated kind of differently, right? That there's still the kind of ruralness or casualness to a lot of the Hawaiian characters, that the white characters are still the ones driving the story. And also that we have this sense still that this multicultural world is not Japan. This multicultural world is Hawaii, right? And that the one Japanese character we had in the commercial is still going to go back to Japan. That he's not a part of the multicultural world, he's just visiting. So it still keeps this multicultural message separate from images of Japan itself. And then the third thing that I want to say is that this particular video celebrates an image of multiculturalism that I think is kind of disturbingly reminiscent of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, right? That it's showing this model of multiculturalism in which Japanese are leading native peoples in resisting white people. Now that's not that I'm saying there's anything wrong with resisting white people, particularly in colonized or formerly colonized peoples, but that there's a history behind how this rhetoric has been used in Japan, and that there's also the fact that why aren't the local people leading themselves? Right? So we have these kind of problematic aspects that this links us back to. So I hope that through all of this today, I've kind of told you a story of how Pokemon became this big Mukokuseki icon that launched cool Japan, which then incorporated Mukokuseki into this Nihon Jinron idea of what it means to be Japanese or not Japanese. And that recent developments in Pokemon have created some resistance to that, have created some openings in that for more diversity, for more respect or more awareness of other groups. But at the same time that there's this potential that what that's doing is linking back to a negative model of multiculturalism. Okay, so questions or thoughts, comments? Feel free to disagree with me, by the way. Well, there's a point where he's like on Skype with a man in Japan, and they're trading Pokemon via Skype, and it's kind of implied that that's his dad. I would suspect that most viewers would take that as his dad, but you're right, it's not explicit, and so it doesn't have to be true. But we could also talk about how in the game as well, and in most of the games, in fact, it's just the main character and their mom moving to a new place. Very often, dad works in a different city, and you might meet him later in the game. So even the fact that it's in the game, I think, is still connecting back to something we can see when we look at Japanese culture and society. These ideas of sending the father far away to work, and the family being more the mother and the children who do their own things separately. Yes? Well, I would say that, at least in my own opinion, I see this as a positive change over time. That, as you said, it starts out with very limited depictions, but now it gets to the point where you have people whose race is no longer defining their job or their role, and you have the ability of the main character to choose their own race and be whatever race they want to be. And so I think that that is kind of creating more of a space for openness and for not just pigeonholing. So I would say that, yes, the increase is a very important part of that. In the beginning, these kinds of depictions stood out because, as you said, they were the only ones. And when the only black characters are the breakdancers and the basketball players, that stands out. So you're right, that increasing the number and increasing the variety does a better job of highlighting the fact that the multiculturalism is improving without dragging you too much into the idea of these are all terrible representations, because there are many more just neutral representations. Well, I think getting rid of the bad representations is also probably a good idea. And that's, again, something they've done, that they don't have as many. I mean, there are hula dancers who are clearly Hawaiian in Hawaii, but I don't think that's particularly problematic because there are also Hawaiian-looking women who just wear normal clothes. Yes? Okay, so you think that the next step after choosing an ethnicity is being an assigned one different from your own. Like in the next game, I have to be a Hispanic woman, for example, or something like that, so that you can kind of build more empathy with groups like that and relate to them. I think that if there's a demand for that from consumers, that can happen. But I think that the first step would be for some games to try that and see if people are happy with it. I would totally be willing to try that.
Some games have done that. Yeah. So there's games out there that assign you a character randomly with a color or gender, and there has been a fairly big backlash against them because a lot of people refuse to play. A lot of men refuse to play as a woman of color, for example. So they have been struggling, but they also get a lot of attention for this very reason of saying let's go beyond this. Let's pick and choose. Let's try. It doesn't really matter, right? It's fake color blindness idea is still there. It shows us that it's really, really fake. It's not there. So there's games out there that have tried it. Not Pokemon yet, but there's a token girl in the group, right? Do you ever see her playing in the fights? It's always the guys, right, that are showing off. So there's another thought we can put in there. It's there in the picture, but she doesn't really ever get given a high five, if you think that. She's kind of just there on the side. So look, she can do it. Kinda, maybe, but not really. Before we go, we say thank you to Carl for coming out.